Presentation for our second follow-up session of our introductory workshop. This session will support what we did on December 5th and December 12th. If you did not see those, we have them recorded and we'll send them if you haven't already received the links. We're recording this large group session. We will not record the breakout groups. They will be posted, the recording will be posted later on our YouTube channel. As a reminder, please mute your phones. Keep yourself muted on this Zoom call until we are in breakout groups. Be aware technical difficulties can arise. We're doing the best we can to keep everything running smoothly, but glitches can happen. Just last week, I lost Wi-Fi connection on my computer for several days. In our last session, Zoom tried to send us to breakout groups too early before we finished watching the video. So to avoid that happening again, if a little dialog box comes up and says, go to breakout groups, don't do that until we tell you we're going to breakout groups. So if we're in the middle of a video, wait. And if there is any question, you can put a chat in the chat box. We will have 2 more follow-up sessions on January 23rd and January 30th. We'll keep you up to date on emails. If I don't have your email, please email me at coatlantageorgia@gmail.com and I will put you on the distribution list. The same Zoom link you received today will be used for our other sessions. If you have any questions, you can email us at that address. Now, Paul Reeves will read some questions and answers about centering prayer that were submitted.
Well, good morning, everyone. So good to be with y'all. So here are the questions that were asked. The first one, if you can't stop the thought and the sacred word doesn't work, what do you do? What if the thought gets louder and louder? Sometimes it sounds like a battle. Screaming the sacred word to drown out the thought is certainly no feather on a cloud. Help me. Well, let me begin by saying thank you for this question, because this is a question that needed to be asked. Absolutely. Every single one of us will become very familiar with a scenario at some point in our prayer time. Let me begin by reminding myself and each of us that our thoughts are not only normal, but they're necessary. So we don't try to stop our thoughts. As long as our minds, as long as we're alive, our minds are going to be thinking. Remember that it's unbelievable that our minds produce 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day. So your minds are going to be thinking. Our minds are supercomputers. The different focus in centering prayer is how we view our thoughts, not as something to control, but we allow our thoughts to shift into the background. We let our thoughts come and we let our thoughts go. Centering prayer helps us detach from our thoughts, not eliminate them. Now, when we quiet down, we naturally become aware of all these thoughts that are hanging out in the background of our mind. And sometimes it can feel overwhelming. I think one of the most helpful things is to remember just to simply accept that your thoughts are going to be there. We don't get surprised or upset by any of this. Remember, our thoughts are integral, they're inevitable, and they're a normal part of our practice. The sacred word is introduced not to dispel our thoughts, but to return our intention to consent to God's presence and action within. I think once we can accept that our thoughts are not only normal, but necessary, and this is important, that they're a necessary part of our healing process, then we can treat them in a more friendly way. We don't think of them as these intruders that, get out of here. But we know that this is a necessary part of our healing process. Remember, we don't try to fight anything in this prayer. Remember the phrase, what we resist, persist. So if you have a thought and you're thinking, I don't want to think this thought, I'm going to do everything I can not to think this thought, that only gives fuel for the fire. Remember the analogy of if someone were to say, whatever you do, don't look up at the ceiling. You could have cared less what your ceiling looked like, but as soon as someone says that, you go, I have to look up. So we don't try to fight anything. What we're learning is how to let go. And something else that might ease your mind in the process as well is just remember, every time we return to our sacred word, it's an act of love. So I hope that helps. The second question, also very much needed to be asked. I sit for 20 minutes twice a day. My intention is to consent to God's presence and action. I have my sacred word. What I do not know, I always have thoughts. I usually do not engage. I do not resist them. So that means I say the sacred word nonstop. So basically, this is the question of, when do we use our sacred word? We use our sacred word as a tool. This is a tool for your use. You don't serve the tool. You don't owe your sacred word anything. You don't have to return constantly throughout. If you were constantly thinking, I think this is helpful, and this was helpful for me, is if you're always thinking, oh, I have to return to my sacred word, well, that in itself becomes a thought too. So this tool is there to assist you to surrender to God's presence and action within. So as long as thoughts are coming and going on their own accord, you don't need to feel compelled to use your word. Remember the analogy of the two people having a conversation at a cafe on a busy street. Cars are constantly going by. Those are like our thoughts. And you're not constantly thinking, oh my goodness, there's like a car, there's another car, there's another car. You're just having a conversation. But every now and again, maybe a big bus comes by, or someone beeps their horn, or someone yells at someone, and it interrupts your conversation. Our sacred word acts in a similar manner to when you go, oh, excuse me, hold on, I got distracted. Where were we at? And then this, it's like saying, oh yes, I'm here with you, God, to surrender to your presence and action within me. So at the beginning of our sit, we might find ourselves repeating the word more often as it becomes a part of our heart and being. But we then find ourselves settling down, and then we only use our word whenever the need arises. But as long as our thoughts are just innocently floating around, we don't need to feel compelled to return to the word. Remember, we let them come, we let them go. We are detached from our thoughts. It's our attitude that makes the difference. If you find yourself particularly engaged with a thought, then you ever so gently remember your sacred word. The last question that we have for today is, do you have any tips for bringing a second sit into the daily practice? And I think that this is also very relatable. I know for myself, it's not easy for us to wake up super early, but you can always wake up before everyone else in the household. So you can always find time for the first sit. A lot of times in the evening, I know for me, it's like, well, you get home from work and you have a family that needs, you're doing dinner, you're doing family activities, and sometimes it feels a bit awkward to go, now I'm going to leave y'all for 20 minutes. I've found myself sometimes doing abbreviated sits. I've found myself where my son had baseball practice, and I would go to the car, and just people were thinking I was just a tired dad sleeping, and that's okay. I would say maybe try to do a 5-minute sit, and like I've heard when you're trying to develop a habit, when someone doesn't like to floss their teeth, they'll say, well, I'll floss one tooth, you know, and as soon as you floss one tooth, you go, I'll, oh, what the heck, I'll floss the other ones while I'm here. And so sometimes when you do a 5-minute sit, it naturally becomes more of a 10 or 15-minute, or you can do a 20-minute sit, but you'll be surprised just how much this second sit will reward you. So sometimes you just have to do it. And I think even though it may feel sometimes awkward retreating from the family, they'll notice the difference in you. And I think like my family, they know that I'm a better version of myself. I'm a better dad. I'm a better husband. So sometimes you just have to do it. But you'll be pleasantly surprised of just how much this will reward you. So we'll send you a resource letter with these answers this afternoon. And please, if you have any other questions, please send them to our email address. That will be in that email, and we'll answer those in the next gathering. I would like to now turn it over to Buzz McOmber from St. Philip's Cathedral Parish, who will guide us in our 20-minute session.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see such a good turnout with all the delays and distractions and everything that we've all had. I've been probably around centering prayer. Well, I've been around it for maybe 10 years, but I'm a little bit of a slow learner because that was Kimberly that got us all started. And it took me 3 or 4 years to really begin to dip my toe into the centering prayer lake. And I'm certainly glad I did. It's a wonderful practice. What I have found, one of the things that I have found to be very helpful for me is the use of the Centering Prayer app. And hopefully you have downloaded it on your cell phone. I'll show you mine. It's right over here. You can see the icon on it. And let me just bring it up here so you can see the beginning screen. And you have the way to customize how the app interacts with you during the 20-minute sit. And I'm going to read just from the beginning, kind of the 4 guidelines of centering prayer. And so that you can get a feel for what, again, just to refamiliarize you if you haven't been exposed to the app before. And this is a reinforcement of everything that we just heard. And I think Paul was listening in on some of my centering prayers because I have all those issues. So there are 4 things. 1, choose a sacred word, which is a symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. Sitting comfortably and with eyes closed, settle briefly and silently introduce the sacred word as the symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. When engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. And at the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a couple of minutes. So as a prayer, I often like to use the Psalm 46 verse 10, which I think we may have heard in our first session as well. But for me, it provides a really nice dividing line between all of the turmoil around us and entering into that quiet space that we are looking for God to enter. So I will start with that. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know, be still, be. We'll close today's sit with the Lord's Prayer. In your individual practice, I'd invite you to choose any prayer that helps you to continue to maintain that space where you can increase God's presence within you. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Buzz, for
My
leading
pleasure.
us. Now we will watch a video of Father Thomas, and the name of the video is called The Discipline of Centering Prayer.
The last time we spoke, we emphasized the relationship that with God that is taking place in this private room, especially when we're learning to pray in secret, which seems to be the place where God can be most found. In this talk, let's look at centering prayer from a disciplinary point of view. That is to say, how does the proper practice of centering prayer further the relationship? Of course, the discipline of centering prayer is not an end in itself. It's totally in the service of deepening the relationship and moving it from conversation to communion, from active form of prayer to a very receptive form of prayer. So here goes. First of all, once we get into our private room and have closed the door and bolted it if necessary, and have taken a position where we won't have to think of ourselves or how uncomfortable we are, and have turned our intention as well as our general loving attention to God's presence and action within us, to which we consent. And our just being there with the whole of our being, giving our complete presence to God, we're offering ourselves, like that couple I spoke of in the last tape, completely to God. Here I am. We're waiting for God. We're not doing anything except maintaining our original intention to consent to God's presence and action. And so in this prayer, and any kind of analysis of what's going on is totally inappropriate. This is not a research project. And when you're entering into an intimate conversation, especially into communion with someone, it's not the time to analyze your feelings or your psychological state. If you feel love, you feel love. You don't have to talk about it, analyze it, or look it up in the dictionary. So no analysis of what's going on in the prayer, such as, am I entering into the night of sense, perhaps? Or do all these thoughts indicate this is not meant for me? All that is baloney, is to be disregarded. no analysis of any kind. Secondly, there should be no expectations of any kind, that something great is going to happen. The greatest thing that can happen is already happening, namely the divine Holy Trinity, the divine indwelling is present within us and totally available to us, giving us his complete presence, attention, as if we were, so to speak, the only thing in all creation. And so the problem is in how present we are to this presence. And hence, our expectations get in the way of being present because they involve the future. Expectations belong to what's to come into the future, whereas consent refers to the present moment. And the present moment with God's full presence is what is. And so to find God fully, we too have to gradually lure ourselves, so to speak, into the present moment too. And prayer in secret greatly helps that project. So the urgency or the compulsion or the habit or the addiction of thinking of ourselves in some way, do I like this or don't I like this? Do I want more or do I want less? Am I doing okay or am I making a mistake? All of that is for the birds. I mean, it doesn't belong at this level of communion and intimacy. It's like being in the arms of God. What more do you want, for heaven's sake? It's like a kiss. Somebody is kissing you. It's not the time to talk about the weather. In fact, it's not the time to talk about anything. Otherwise, you'll miss some of the intimacy of the kiss, I would suspect. In any case, no expectations. And there should be no goals, aims, or purposes. Love doesn't have purposes. Love is its own excuse for being. Love is its own reward, as St. Bernard says in one of his books. You don't need anything else if you've got love, especially in the moments when you are, in fact, experiencing being loved. That's the time to receive it and not to say anything. And so utter silence is the proper attitude in the private room, of which, as we've said, centering prayer is simply a how-to method appropriate to our time. Now, there are other goals that we might have, such as repeating the sacred symbol we've chosen, which is usually the sacred word that you've chosen in a period of silent prayer, asking the Spirit to suggest something. It's not so much the word, as we've said before, and its content that's important, but rather its capacity simply to express your intention to spend this time with God, to be in communion with God, to be totally open and available and present to God. And so we recommend a certain discretion in the way that you use the sacred word. It doesn't have to be repeated non-stop. The discreet use of the sacred word means that you use it when you need it. And when you need it is when other thoughts or perceptions come down the stream of consciousness. Let me remind you that in the contents of centering prayer, thoughts mean any perception whatsoever, such as memories, plans, external sensations, interior sensations, concepts, emotions, memories, any particular concept, whether sensible, mental, or spiritual, is a thought in the terminology that we use in centering prayer. So some thoughts, of course, we're indifferent to. They're just the inevitable passage of, of our imagination from one thing to another. And so we have to have a friendly attitude towards thoughts in general, which is very different from getting involved with the thoughts. We resist no thought. We hang on to no thought. We react emotionally to no thought. And we return to the sacred word when you notice you're getting interested, either by attraction or by aversion, with any particular thought or perception. Now, I should mention here that there is a method called mantric prayer that appears both in the Eastern religions and in some degree in the Christian tradition, especially the Jesus prayer, which is repeated again and again, sometimes with a word, sometimes without it, and sometimes with certain breathing practices that accompany it, and sometimes without it. So a kind of prayer, mantric prayer, in which you continually say the same word again and again, is a distinct practice from centering prayer. It's a good one. We don't claim that centering prayer is the only one, but we suggest that it's a suitable one, considering the human condition at the end of the millennium. And we offer it to you to try. We don't obviously insist that you do it. This is one method of engaging with the divine presence in the inner room. That's the essence. However you get there, that's the essence. But a centering prayer, it does not require the constant repetition of the sacred word or of some other sacred symbol. We've mentioned the sacred gaze, and we've mentioned the sacred breath, which is not following the breath, which would be a perception, but simply noticing very casually that you're breathing when some thought that attracts your attention, gets to be center stage in your interior awareness. But in the beginning, because we have such a habit of thinking, and the interior dialogue is so well established that you can't think of life without it, you have to return again and again to the sacred word, which is as you remember, simply a reaffirmation of the original intention you had when you started the centering prayer and sat down in your inner room, having closed the door, supposedly on thoughts. But the thoughts have a way of getting in anyway. They don't respect doors, windows, or bolts. So when an attractive thought comes down, then we return to the sacred word. In the beginning, you may have to say the sacred word almost constantly to maintain that intention because of the bombardment of our ordinary thinking apparatus. But you don't say it with impatience. You say it ever so gently to emphasize that you don't have a negative attitude towards these thoughts, because that will not help. The thoughts are inevitable. It's our attitude to the thoughts, not having no thoughts, that is the sign of progress. And the proper attitude is to let them all go by without paying attention to them at all. Now, that capacity is going to take time to establish as a habit, and since we've established the other habit for the past 10, 20, 30, 40, and whatever years, it's going to take a few weeks, months to get this new capacity to be detached inwardly or to be free inwardly from following the more or less interesting thoughts that may come down the stream of consciousness as we are waiting with the Lord with the intention of consenting presence to his presence and action within us. A second goal that we should avoid is the naive hope of having no thoughts. There is a time in centering prayer where there may not be thoughts, but it's very brief, and it requires the Spirit suspending our rational faculties so that they can't think, or the imagination can't produce images. But this is in the mystical Christian tradition is considered to be rather rare. St. Teresa thinks it only lasts maybe half an hour at most. Although it's worth saying that in the 13th century mystics of the Beguine tradition, which was incidentally a lay movement, they seem to have had ecstasies or this suspension of their thinking faculties for hours at a time, and even for 3 or 4 days. Again, this is not necessarily something to be desired, it's just something that can happen. The essence is not our experience of centering prayer, but our fidelity to the regular practice, which leads to the change of our attitudes in daily life. So in one sense, the centering prayer practice and contemplative prayer into which it leads is a preparation for action or for daily life, where you might say the real battle for transformation and union with God takes place. I said it was naive to think of having no thoughts. If you actually had no thoughts, you could be dead. Because one of the signs of life is the capacity to think. So we mustn't have a negative idea of thinking as though it was a disaster or bad. It's one of the greatest triumphs of evolution up to this point, to have the universe become conscious of itself through the reflection of human beings. The point is, it's not the end of the journey. It's not the greatest faculty. And it's a hindrance when we are trying to relate to God at a deeper level than thinking, which is the spiritual level of our being, and to relate to the divine presence, which is at an even deeper level. The divine presence is the source from which our being arises at every level, physical, mental, and spiritual, at every microsecond. So we welcome the thoughts, but not with attachment. We welcome them in the sense of paying no attention to them. No thought can prevent this prayer from going by unless we get interested in it and consent to it. And it's the consent to the thought or perception that subtly draws us out of our basic intention that requires us to renew our original intention to be in God's presence and to consent to his action. Similarly, a third point that would be some people make as a goal, which would be a mistake, is by means of the sacred word or the sacred symbol to make the mind a blank. This would not be healthy or a health. The mind is not meant to be a blank. It is and the emptying of thoughts is not with the purpose of not having any thoughts at all. The purpose is always to be detached from the thoughts and be able to maintain our intent to consent to God's presence throughout the prayer. Hence, it's a very receptive kind of preparation for contemplative prayer. Notice I said preparation. I might just add here that centering prayer is not strictly contemplative prayer in the sense of St. John of the Cross and other authors who always have taught that contemplative prayer is a sheer gift. what it is a preparation by reducing the obstacles and helping our listening apparatus to be sensitive to the subtle movements of the Spirit, which, remember, are taking place in secret, that is, in utter silence. We can't perceive them directly, except when grace is especially strong, but that's always temporary. And our goal is not for some temporary satisfaction, but for the permanent state of transformation in which our presence and awareness to God's presence becomes a part of our everyday awareness, without interfering with the practical details of daily life, so that one can cook breakfast and pick up the children at the school and whatever else your occupations are, without your being distracted in any way from the effectiveness of your activity, while at the same time the presence of God is subtly present as a kind of ever-present awareness, without your being able to do anything about it. And the deeper that awareness becomes, the less you can get away from it, even if you try. It becomes a part of oneself in everyday life. A fourth goal that we should avoid is feeling sensible consolation. Well, every now and then the pleasure of centering prayer, and it predominates precisely because the movement of the contemplative gifts of the Spirit have touched us, or God has grasped our will that we have been offering or surrendering to him. And now there's a sense of God's presence, a sense of peace, a sense of coming home that can overflow into the senses and make your heart beat faster. It can even have a slightly erotic a feeling, a great desire for God. We mustn't think of erotic love in terms of genital activity merely, but eros refers to the whole gamut of pleasure that is designed by God to be a stepping stone to God. Unfortunately, with the false self system, pleasure has become for many people a substitute for God. But occasional pleasure in prayer helps to orientate us into where we're going. It helps concentration, perhaps more than anything else. Emotional involvement in the prayer is a great source of concentration. But you can't count on it. Hence, it's useless to make it a goal. And you don't, and as you deepen in the spiritual life, you no longer need sensible consolation. And in fact, there's a disinclination for it because it preoccupies one's attention from the refinements of pure love, from the refinements of God's presence. But I would never suggest trying to resist the pleasure of sensible consolation, because it may be that our particular psychological history needs this kind of affirmation from God to heal the deep wounds that we might have brought from early childhood, such as a feeling of rejection. Many people in our culture have a low self-image, and I think God, one of the purposes of divine consolation, especially of a sensible kind, is to provide what some people were denied, an embrace that really meant love, a fondling, and that an infant needs, a sense of belonging, a sense of being wanted, a sense of being loved. Actually, for human beings, only love, genuine love, brings us into full human being. Otherwise, there's always a doubt somewhere in our psyche as to whether being alive or being a human being is such a hot idea. So God provides in the spiritual journey in remarkable ways for whatever was missing. Maybe not completely if the privation was very serious, but that's the reason why we don't resist the feeling of sensible consolation, but we don't put it before us as a goal, so that when it doesn't happen, we begin to get edgy and irritable and say to ourselves, well, if God is going to treat me this way, he can forget it. I'm not coming to pray anymore. And so people can be very childish in their relations to God, and also there's a tendency to project onto God how we would feel if a human person treated us this way. So like if you're making friends with someone and you reach a certain point of intimacy, if they take a long trip without telling you, or they pay no attention to you for a while, or they seem to be more interested in somebody else for a while, you get jealous and you figure there's other people in the world, if I put my investment in this guy or this gal. And so we do the same with God. In other words, if you get attached to sensible consolation, then you say, well, tit for tat. If God doesn't console me, he can't expect me to show up here at great cost to myself twice a day. In any case, there's a fifth goal that some people have, which is similar to this, and that is having a spiritual experience of some kind. It's just a little different because spiritual experience can be purely spiritual. It's much more profound and much more unifying. It goes much deeper than sensible experience, although on occasion it can overflow into the senses. But its source, as St. Teresa describes it in the Interior Castle, comes from a much deeper place. It's much more substantial, and it's much more transforming. It orientates us to the spiritual relation to God, which is ultimately the one that we have to settle for, and indeed is far beyond sensible consolation in its effects. So we might find then in our centering prayer practice or distinguish in general three tracks. There's the ordinary psychological awareness that we bring with us into the private room and deliberately let go of with an intent of our will to be in the presence of God during this time. Then thoughts come down the stream of consciousness, inevitably. We pay no attention to them insofar as we can. But most of the time, especially in the beginning, they pay so much attention to us that they set off in and are conscious, and remember we have an unconscious level of motivation too. The desires for affection, esteem, power, control, and security and survival that are the instinctual needs of early childhood that all of us depend on for pleasure or happiness in the beginning of our lives, and hence are deeply rooted as projects. So if some thought comes down that touches one of those drives or projects with some symbol in the culture, that then they get activated, and then you get interested in the thought, and you hop on the boat, if that's what we could call these thoughts or perceptions, and you're carried downstream completely out of your intention, and you just have to start again. And remember, we always say, whenever you notice you're thinking about another thought, just get off the boat. Start over without the least self-recrimination or disappointment. It's just the way it is, and it's going to take time to establish the habit. After a while, after returning to the sacred word again and again and again, which is always an act of love, hence if you spend 19 and a half minutes of the 20-minute period returning to the sacred word, it's still a wonderful prayer because you've made perhaps thousands of acts of love. And charity, God's love, grows in us by the repetition of acts, like faith and hope, the other two theological virtues. But this third track may arise in which, in somewhere in the middle of the prayer, you become aware that you're not interested in any thoughts. And that means that the contemplative gifts have touched you at a deep level and have grasped your will even though not firmly, even though not completely. And so you're aware that you're not interested in the thoughts that come down the stream of conscience. In that situation, you can simply rest in the presence of God. You don't need to return to the sacred symbol because you're already in the place where the sacred symbol is designed to take you, which is complete disregard of the thoughts that are going by. Hence, in centering prayer, intention is the main focus of our practice.
So thank you for viewing, and I'm sure there are many things that touched you as he was talking, or even questions. So now we will break it into small groups, and your facilitator will guide the discussion. And so a dialogue box will pop up in a minute and say, are you willing to join a breakout group? And yes is your answer. See you in a few minutes. Might be a good time to get a cup of coffee.
Perfect time for her to say that, because here comes the dialogue box.
Thank you for being with us today. We are thankful for you. We are in this together. As our final blessing, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face on you and give you peace. Thank you, everyone. See you next Saturday.